If there's data that you have stored in a relational database somewhere, like for example in this SQL Server database here, I've got a table called Material Properties, and here's some data I would like to bring into AF. If you've got a situation like this with SQL Server, or really any OLEDB compliant relational database, you can do that a couple of different ways. One of the ways we can bring it in is to simply import it, in which case we kind of bring it in en masse and duplicate it as a read-write table in AF. So it would basically be a brand new table. I can call this, data from SQL or whatever it is that it's actually called. And then one of the options here is, as you can see, is import. In the previous video we showed you how to define one. You don't have to define it now, you simply have to know where the data is. And when you do import this, you're going to have to know some SQL specifics here. You're going to have to know how to connect to that table. Now the second way is to link this. And by linking it, what we mean is we're simply establishing a link to this table, and then we're retrieving it as we are required to, as the AF clients request the information. And of course that's nice because it doesn't duplicate the data. The data still stays in its original location. We only bring it in when we need to. It gives you a read-only link to that original table. So the import brings it in, creates a new table that's read-write. Link will bring it in a kind of an ad hoc basis, just whenever you need it, and it'll be read-only. And as you're going to notice, as you're doing this, this is the point at which we have to get somebody involved who's got some relational database knowledge, who's familiar with making SQL queries, etc. So yeah, I'm sorry if if you're not the person at your site who's doing that kind of work, who's familiar with making queries like this select statement you see up here. If you're not really involved in that, better get them involved at this point, because this is the point at which we don't have a graphical user interface for creating these queries. We simply ask you to use the SQL expertise you've got locally for going out and making these retrievals. As you're going to notice, there are a tremendous number of options when it comes to security. And so in this video, what we're going to do is just kind of go over what some of those fundamentals are and then point you over to where you can learn more. And again, at that point, you're very likely going to have to get some local IT resources to decide, whether you're going to be impersonating the client or connecting user SQL credentials, etc., all those choices. So first what we're going to do now is we're going to show you how to import. Then we're going to show you how to link to the existing table without duplicating the data into AF. And then later on, we're going to go over some of the security recommendations and where to find out more information about that. So I'm going to go back into my AF database, and this is the table that I just started creating. It's called Data from SQL, and I specified I was going to use import. So when we click on import, this is where you'd better have somebody standing by who's familiar with your databases, the names of the relational databases you're trying to connect to, and also you're going to need somebody who knows how to build a query. So we'll start by building a connection string. That's what this field is all about. That's where you would put a connection string. If you already have a connection string and you're familiar with what that is, go ahead and use that. But I'm going to use the graphical user interface that comes from Windows. This is really basically a Windows construct here. And what I need to do is go out and find the existing relational databases and specify how we want to retrieve the data. Now I know in this case I've got data that's sitting in SQL Server, so I'm going to choose this Microsoft OLEDB provider for SQL Server. I know that because if I switch over here, you can see I do have a SQL Server table. It's the same copy of SQL Server, by the way, that's holding the AF SQL database, and that's no problem. It can either be that one or some different one. And I've got a table called Material Properties. So I'll go ahead and choose this OLEDB provider for SQL. Now this is where we need to choose which copy of SQL Server, which instance of SQL Server we're connecting to. So I know if I take a look at this drop down, if SQL is configured properly, I should be able to see all the copies of SQL that are out there, all the, I guess they call them instances of SQL Server running out on my network. I'll go ahead and choose this one. Now we get to choose at this point whether we're using Windows integrated security, or if we prefer to use a SQL username and password, you can go ahead and specify SQL username and password. Now that actually has to do, the choice that you make here is now where we're starting to get into some heavy-duty system management topics, because if you take a look at some of our documentation on this, what we're going to specify is that in order to do this, you have to have a login configured. And that login, let me go ahead and open that up. That login can either be specified to be using the Windows Integrated Security or SQL Server Security. So in my case, I'm using, within this login, I'm using Windows Integrated Security. So that's the one I'm going to be choosing in this case. Now, all this stuff that we're seeing right here is stuff that we're going to address a little bit later on when we talk about security. So don't worry if this is stuff you're not familiar with at this point. Again, that's why we suggest that you get somebody involved who's familiar with SQL and specifically applications like the SQL Server Management Studio application for configuring this. So again, I guess to make a long story short, what you put here really depends on how things are configured on SQL Server in your local environment. We've got everything set up here so that we're using Windows Integrated Security, so I'm going to choose that. Let's go ahead and see if I can make the connection. Yeah, I do see a list of the databases that are on that server. I'm going to choose this one. If I test my connection, I can see that that's succeeded. So this looks like it's good news. We're ready to go ahead and make the retrieval or do the import. And the grand finale to this is to go ahead and write a select statement. So this is where I would say something like select density material ID from, and then the name of the table. I'll be honest, if you're not yourself a SQL expert, then you're going to have to go out and use either something like MS Query or Access, or just even the tools within Microsoft SQL Server itself to create that select statement. Now I've already created one here. It's selecting these three columns: material ID, heat capacity, and density, from a total of there were some other columns as well I could have chosen from, but I've just chosen three of the, what are there, 6 columns that we see here: viscosity, melting temperature, etc. I could have chosen those as well, but anyway, I'm just going to copy this, and this is what I'm going to paste as my query. This is what we're going to be, what determines what we're going to import. I'll go ahead and say OK. And if that's worked properly, then what we should see is, there we go, we should see a brand new table. Now this is a table that we have access to, we have control over now, because we've imported it. And if I decide, well, that's not 1.4, that should be 1.7, that's no problem. I can do that because I've got read-write access to this in an imported table. Now you'll notice if we were to do this instead of an import, we were to do this as a link, you really would not have that option, because what we're doing really is linking to the original. In this case, we are bringing this in, we're importing it into AF, which some of you may recognize as being bad technique. I mean, typically you don't want to have duplicate data spread across your system. You know, and now there is the problem of what happens when you change things here. Do they get changed on the original, etc.? But it's an option available. It's a popular feature to be able to import stuff en masse, you know, from SQL Server, and so you can do that.